Do they get microphones? No. Oh, okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm so glad to see so many people here for a very important topic. My name is Dorothy Zinberg, and I was married to Norman Zinberg for more than 3 decades. And it's just wonderful for me, the family, our friends, to see that his work is being carried on. I'm also on the faculty of the Kennedy School, and as you will hear some of these people talk, you'll see what a natural intersection it is of interests in public policy and the work in addictions and drugs. My job is to introduce 2 people who are going to say a few words first. I was thinking, one of the things that strikes terror in my heart after dinner is when someone gets up and says, I'm going to be brief, because then you know you're in for a long haul. Well, so I'm not going to say it, but I'll just try to be brief, that is. We have with us this evening the provost of Harvard University, Dr. Stephen Hyman, who has done very distinguished work in the field of, well, let's say there are 4 fields that he's done very distinguished work in: genetics, neurosciences, molecular biology, and psychiatry. He was at Harvard for 20 years before he went to Washington to head the National Institute of Mental Health, and has been very involved in all the work that goes with it. We're very lucky that he's come back to Harvard to work as the provost on an almost impossible job of refocusing many of our interests, both academic and architectural, for the years ahead. Steve is going to say a few words, but before he does, I also want to introduce our moderator, who is Adele Simmons, again, a colleague, friend of many years standing. And Adele has, well, I first met her, she probably doesn't remember, but I was a freshman advisor at Radcliffe, and she was the president of the Radcliffe Government Association. And you can see from her life's work what a good start you get if you really take local politics and policy very seriously early in life. As you'll see in your programs, Adele has been, well, she was the first woman to have a big administrative position at Princeton. She was the first woman dean of students. She was the president of Hampshire College. She was the president of MacArthur Foundation, and now has moved into really global work on philanthropy and thinking through much more about employment, fair labor practices. Very distinguished career, and we're thrilled to have her as the moderator. She will introduce our speakers, and I will ask the provost to say a few words to all of you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you for making sure that we have yet another of these wonderful lectures which bring important outside speakers to address the topic of addiction in Norman's memory. This is, especially for the students, a very important topic. First, obviously, addiction has an enormous impact not only on health, but on the ability of young people to fulfill their life aspirations, impacts on families, impacts on society, including not only cost, but crime, lives diverted, an enormous burden on the criminal justice system. At the same time, it is a topic that engages all of our best thought, ranging from neuroscience and behavioral science at one end to issues around policy at another. But policy discussions around addiction are never simple and straightforward and grounded in data, because addiction engages often very strong feelings, sometimes polemical feelings, not only because many people and many aspects of our society have felt ravaged by this condition of addiction, but also because of the ongoing difficult problems that we have between our sense of what is in our minds and what is a matter of voluntary and willful behavior versus what is a disease that impairs volition, and even the issue of what are the risk factors for engaging with drugs and becoming addicted. And I think we all too often have too simplistic a picture of how one moves from drug experimentation into this terrible condition. We're fortunate to have three wonderful speakers here tonight. I have promised not to say anything about them because they will now be introduced by our moderator. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for joining us this evening and for emphasizing the importance of the topic at hand. Tonight's panel is in honor of the late Norman Zinberg, who for 4 decades was a teacher, clinician, and researcher at the Harvard Medical School. His work greatly influenced the ways in which we think about drugs and addictions today. With his then student, Andrew Weil, Norman conducted the first federally approved experiments on the impact of marijuana on human subjects in a house in Cambridge, with the Cambridge police always on hand, more as voyeurs, I think, than as law enforcement officers. Their findings revealed that much of the response to the drug was related to the social setting in which it was used, and not simply the psychopharmacological properties of the drug itself. In 1970, when drug use appeared to threaten the capacity of our troops in Vietnam, Norman was sent as an independent observer of heroin consumption by the armed forces. Once more, he reported that the majority of the troops were not addicts, but rather responding to stress, and they wanted time to appear to go away quickly, a characteristic of heroin. His advice was, do not treat these people like addicts. Get them home, get them jobs. This was quite different from what was occurring in U.S. cities at that time, and was not, in his view, an appropriate, the pattern of treatment in the U.S. was not appropriate for these military people. While Norman wanted to understand this difference, he strongly believed that the punitive nature of drug policy in the United States contributed to the harmful impact of these drugs. In the years before he died, Norman was engaged in research on the ways in which marijuana reduced nausea among cancer patients receiving chemotherapy, and also in trying to introduce policies that would allow for needle exchange for drug addicts, having watched entire families in Cambridge die from AIDS that had infected one member of the family who had taken drugs with dirty needles. The Zinberg AIDS Clinic at Cambridge Hospital memorializes his work to create a more humane setting for the treatment of this disease. Norman's international reputation was based on his work on drugs, but many of us knew him as a wise observer of social behavior and trends, a superb psychoanalyst, and a very good friend. We have tonight outstanding experts in their fields, panelists whose work in fact, reflects the range of Norman's work. I'm going to introduce them all and then ask them to come and make their remarks. Dr. Alan Leshner has been Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences and Executive Publisher of the journal Science magazine since 2001. The AAAS was founded in 1848. And for those of you who don't know, it's the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific and engineering society. Before going to the AAAS, Dr. Leshner was director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, during the Clinton administration. NIDA is one of the scientific institutes of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, and it supports 85% of the world's research on health aspects of drug abuse and addiction. Before joining NIDA, Dr. Leshner was at the NIMH, the National Science Foundation, and a professor of psychology at Bucknell University. Dr. Lorraine Siggins is the psychiatrist-in-chief at Yale University Health Services. She is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. She comes to us from Australia, where she did her medical training, and she's been at Yale in various roles since the 1960s. As chief psychiatrist of the Yale University Health Services, she oversees the mental health service that provides mental health services to students and education and outreach to the student community. At Harvard, Dr. Siggins is chair of the visiting committee for the University Health Services and a member of the visiting committee to the college. And finally, Sanho Tree is a fellow and director of the Drug Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. This project works to end the domestic and international war on drugs and replace it with policies that promote public health and safety, as well as economic alternatives to the prohibition of drug economy. He's very interested in the intersection between race and poverty and has been spending a great deal of his time recently doing work on Colombia and the impact of the U.S. drug policies in Colombia. Sanho is a graduate of Hampshire College, and I don't think I've seen you since graduation day, so it's a real pleasure to have you here today. So without further ado, let me turn it over to the panel. Each is going to speak for 12 minutes, and I've agreed I'm going to pass them notes when they have 3 minutes to go. We need to end here around 9:20. There are those who think the event of the day is the California recall election, and there will be a group here just coming in at 9:30 to talk about that. But of course, I will be going back to watch the Cubs game.
Thank you. I want you to know I live in abject fear of Adele and that little piece of paper that says you have 3 minutes. So I'm going to speak astoundingly quickly, but don't worry, I'm only going to make very few points. I'm a scientist. I'm incapable of speaking without slides. So indulge me. You look there, I'll talk here. You're going to have to watch it. It's like a tachistoscope, if you remember your psychology courses. Basically, the fundamental point that I want to make is that 2 decades of research have fundamentally revolutionized our understanding of drug abuse and addiction, their complexity, and what it is that we ought to be doing about it. And what I want to do is to make a few points where I'll actually pose a couple of questions, give you sort of titillating answers in the hopes of provoking more conversation later. So the first one is an obvious one that people ask all the time. Why do some people get into trouble with drugs and other people don't? Some people are able to experiment with apparent impunity. Other people take drugs relatively few times and their lives are devastated. Well, the answer is a truism. In fact, it's true about everything. Everything is an interaction between genes and the environment. I do want to make the point, though, that the contribution of genetics to the susceptibility to becoming addicted is incredibly high, certainly relative to most people's understanding. And this is just a compilation of a variety of studies that show, as you can see, between 60 and 80% of the variability among individuals in their susceptibility to becoming addicted is contributed by their genetics. Now, it's of course not just about genes. Genes don't doom you to become an addict. What in fact happens is that there are a variety of environmental factors that also affect addictability, and you'll be intrigued to know there are 70 risk factors for drug abuse and addiction, and they're the same risk factors as anything else bad that can happen to you. But a meaningful question to which we have no answer is actually, how do genes and the environment interact with each other to determine whether someone will in fact become addicted? It's a subject everybody talks about, we know very little about, and just to pose it in the most extreme form, for example, how can poverty in fact alter gene expression in critical metabolic pathways in a way that in fact would translate into Harry or Sally becoming more likely to become addicted? Okay, next question. How am I doing? Is that fast enough? I grew up in the Catskill Mountains in New York. I can do this. So after a person has used drugs for a while, why can't they just cut it out? And the truth is, in contrast to popular belief, relatively few people actually quit an addiction out of dint of will by itself. So as my friend Barry McCaffrey, when he was the drug czar, used to say, it's because their brains have been rewired by their drug use. And the truth is that using drugs, in fact, changes the brain in fundamental and long-lasting ways that persist long after the individual has stopped using drugs. I'm going to give you just one example of it, and that's a study from Brookhaven National Labs, actually done by my successor, the now director of NIDA, Nora Volkoff, studying methamphetamine addicts. These are PET scans. The measure, bright is more, dull is less. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but you can see it as clearly as I. We're measuring binding to the dopamine reuptake transporter. And in fact, if you look at the slide, you'll see on the top a normal individual. On the bottom is a methamphetamine addict 5 months after that individual stopped using methamphetamine. So it's a long-lasting, persistent brain change. It's in a brain area that could have effects on cognition, on emotion, on a variety of other variables. And in fact, what's important is that it has obvious behavioral consequences. What you see on the right is a slide showing you a cognitive deficit in those same group of individuals, and the red lines show the correlation between the magnitude of the transporter deficit and the magnitude of the behavioral deficit. The point is that prolonged drug use changes the brain in ways that in fact are translated into behavioral consequences of having been addicted. The unanswered question is, does the brain go back? The answer is, in some ways yes, in some ways no, and we can come back to that again later too. I've been playing with a metaphor for many years that's an analogy to there being a switch in the brain, so that you begin as a voluntary drug user, right? Drug use, and you have total control over it, and then over time, whoops, do you like that? I can make that do that again. It's as if a switch flipped and you move from a state of voluntary drug user into a state of being a compulsive drug user who has, in effect, lost a great amount, not all, but a great amount of control over their drug use and their behavior. It's a metaphor that has been met with varying degrees of acceptance, even in the drug abuse science community. There's sort of what I call metaphor envy ongoing. Some people like quicksand, other people like a whirlpool or whatever, but take the switch for the moment. The point is that you move from one brain state to another, and it is that change in brain state that moves you from a voluntary drug user to a compulsive drug user. And of course, we don't know the exact switch. But what we've learned in the last few years is that, in fact, the brain circuitry involved is actually the same circuitry that's involved in other motivated behaviors. And of course, that makes sense, since your brain didn't evolve for drug use. It evolved for normal stuff. And in the course of it, right, drugs have become a part of life. And I'm going to show you, I just like this. Just look at it while it does it. The point is obvious. Okay, what's actually, I believe, happening is that over time, drugs are in fact capturing the brain's normal motivational circuits and rearranging motivational priorities. And I'll show you just one example of that from a study by Elliot Stein, who then was at the Medical College of Wisconsin, now is at NIDA. So what you're looking at is the brain response, only the brain response, not a behavioral response, of either cocaine addicts or normal individuals exposed to various visual stimuli that are in fact videos, okay? So if you see a normal individual, on the left, that individual in the white bar barely responds, that individual's brain barely responds to a cocaine video, but to an erotic film has a tremendous response, good, healthy person, right? On the other hand, the cocaine addict, the white bar, has a tremendous brain response to the cocaine video, no drug, just exposure to the cues, right? And that's accompanied by tremendous craving, and then has a much lesser response to the sexual stimuli. What's important here is that the cocaine addiction is not wiping out the response to the sexual stimuli. What I think it's actually doing is reordering the priorities so that drug goes all the way up to the top, and then, right, sex gets moved down. This helps explain conceptually things like how a crack-addicted mother could in fact neglect her children. It's not that she doesn't love her children. It's that drug has become higher on the motivational hierarchy. and it happens in the brain. These brain changes are in fact why we say that addiction is a brain disease. It's expressed in the form of a behavior, compulsive behavior, and of course both developing it and recovering from it depend both on behavior and the social context in which they occur. It also helps to answer the question that I posed of why addicts can't just cut it out. They are in fact in another brain state, and in fact it's why treatment is necessary. And just to take a minute or two to make the point that we're not making it up so much anymore. That is, we now have science-based treatments, and in fact, yes ma'am, and in fact in 1997, NIDA put out the first ever science-based guide to drug addiction treatment, and I'm not going to go through those principles. I just want to make the point that sort of making it up, doing whatever seems interesting doesn't do it. Holding hands and singing Kumbaya is not the equivalent of science-based treatment. One of those principles that usually surprises people is that drug treatment doesn't have to be voluntary in order for it to be effective. You don't have to want treatment. That's a myth. In fact, this is a study, in the red bars you can see coerced treatment, whereas the blue bars are low pressure and the measure is simply how long people stay in treatment. The truth is, coercion works. People stay in treatment, they get engaged, and they do better. The other principle that's important for a policy discussion is that if we don't treat addicts, criminal offended addicts, while we have them in the criminal justice system, they will be back. And I just want to show you two quick studies. One is looking at reincarceration rates 6 months after release. There you have on the left untreated individuals. And then on the right, you have individuals treated with a medication called naltrexone. This was done at the University of Pennsylvania. The point is only that treating people tremendously reduces their recidivism, whatever the cause of the reason that they're in jail in the first place. And the reverse of this will just show you a different study done at the University of Delaware, which on the left shows the percentage who are arrest-free. It's sort of the opposite measure, and I apologize for the confusion, who are untreated, whereas you can see that about a 70% change for people who are treated. So, we know a lot about drug abuse and addiction, I would argue, and what to do about it. And the question is, what does it mean from a policy perspective? Well, I believe that it means that we should change the nature of our national discourse about this phenomenon and what to do. And let me just rattle through it, and then I'll be done. The first is a simple one, and that is no more polarizing of the issues. Those who pay attention to this issue know that people believe it's either on one end, a failure of will, on the other end, a chronic illness. The truth is, it's both. It's a biological disorder or it's a behavioral disorder. It's both. It's either we should worry about the control end, we should worry about the supply end, people should be punished or people should be treated, and the truth is that the answer there is all of the above. The second principle is no more metaphors. We've all heard too much about the war on drugs, and my vote is we just bag it, which is really a shame because the war on cancer was an incredibly effective public health message that worked very well in garnering support for research and treatment on cancer. It's done nothing for drug abuse. Give it up. And the last principle is that what we have to have is a comprehensive national strategy that looks at all aspects of the phenomenon simultaneously. The good news is that there has been a move towards a blending of what are called criminal justice and health approaches. We can talk more about that later. You can see that a vast number of correctional facilities claim that they offer some kind of treatment. The problem is, of course, that we don't know much about the quality of the programs or the number of slots that they're providing. It could be that a drug counselor walked past the building, waved, and that constitutes drug treatment. And of course, if treatment access and quality are inadequate, it isn't going to work. My core argument is that we have the tools, we now have the science base to actually address the full complexity of drug abuse and addiction, and what it requires is the political will to, in fact, follow the science and get it right. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here tonight. I didn't know Dr. Norman Zinberg, but everything that I have heard about him makes me wish indeed that I had known him, and that the legacy of his work clearly lives on in the people that he taught, and that they're teaching very similar things to their students and their mentees these days. Drug addiction per se is not my area of expertise, and I work in a college mental health service and work with college students. And tonight I'm addressing the issue that has been brought to many people's attention of the increased prescribing for adolescents, and thinking of college students as late adolescents, but adolescents and college students, the increased prescribing of psychotropic medications, particularly antidepressants. First, let me say that there has also been a great deal of emphasis in the press these days about the increasing number of students that are coming for mental health treatment to college mental health services. Various studies have shown that the number of students coming for treatment in the last 10 to 15 years has roughly doubled at most universities across the country, both public and private universities. There has also been studies, and the American College Health Association study has indicated that 45% of students would say that they have been functionally impaired at some time during their 4 years in college due to depression. National surveys of children and adolescents would say that children, these surveys were roughly from the ages of about 12 to 19, 30% of the children reported depressive symptoms, and 10% had moderate to severe depression. Of those adolescents that have had a major depressive episode by 19, 33% of those students will have another depressive episode in the next 4 years. There has also been reports of increasing hospitalization rates in this age group. Along with that, there has been the increase in the prescription of psychotropic medications. This is true for adults as well as for adolescents. In a survey done of the directors of counseling services across the country, the directors said that 10 years ago, 17% of the students coming to their services were taking medications, and now the figure is roughly 30%, and in some universities 40% of the students coming to a mental health service are taking medications. A report in Psychiatric Services on the patterns of antidepressants in children and adolescents say that between 1990 and 1996, the prescriptions for SSRIs, which are a form of antidepressant, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and that these are the drugs like Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, drugs like that, that the prescription for them has increased 70% over that 6-year period. So the question that is usually asked is why? Why the increase in students coming to mental health services, and why the increase in psychotropic medications? First, let me say that in terms of the increase in students coming to mental health services, that there is no definitive answer, of course, on that question, and that there are various theories advanced. And let me tell you what at least some of them are, and I'd be very interested in any ideas that other people have as in part of the discussion later. First theory is that in fact there has been no real increase in the incidence of these disorders, but in fact as mental health care has become less stigmatized, that more students are coming in and getting the appropriate treatment that they might not have gotten say 10 years ago because they might not have sought out the treatment. Another idea is that students with depression in high school are being more successfully treated than they were previously, and that these students therefore are being able to go on to college, and that more of the students being treated in high school mean that more students with a propensity to depression, for instance, are going on to college, and that studies have shown if you have one episode in high school, you're very likely to have another episode, or I think it's 33% likely to have another episode within the next 4 years. A third theory is that there may be an increased vulnerability to depression in the population at large, as in the last 30 years in general we've had better treatment for particularly bipolar illness, both with mood stabilizing drugs and also with antidepressants. So that people with bipolar disorder being better treated are then leading more fulfilled lives, are having very good and successful work careers, marrying, are having families, but that the children of these people may carry with them a certain vulnerability both to depression, bipolar disorder, but also to a number of other psychiatric conditions. And then the question is always the effect that the interaction with the environment occurs in people that do have this vulnerability, so that many people would say that some of what we're seeing has to do with the interaction, say, for example, of inadequate, poor childcare arrangements in people who may already be vulnerable because of their hereditary background. I now want to move on quickly to say how this affects, and particularly to address the difficulty in diagnosis in this age group, in both adolescents and in college students. And to point out that the college age range, roughly 17 to 23 or 4, is the time nationally and internationally where major mental illness first expresses itself. That this is the age group across the country, it has not to do with college, but has to do with the age where it first becomes, expresses itself. This would be true for bipolar illness and also true for schizophrenia. So that when a student or an adolescent, a high school student, a college student, starts to have significant difficulties, early on it is very difficult to know diagnostically what one is seeing, particularly if you're there as the illness is beginning to unfold. So at one point one might think that someone has symptoms that make one think of obsessive compulsive disorder, but it may well be that 2 years later this student has a paranoid disorder. Or it may be that someone that has a severe depression and 2 years later they see they may have a schizoaffective disorder or may have bipolar illness. Or it may be that what you're seeing is just a normal sophomore where something will just work itself out over the next 2 years. And you really, the more experience that I have in this area, I find it very difficult to know early on. So you have to keep very close touch with the student and follow the unfolding of what's happening in them so you can address it as it goes along. And that it is very, very difficult to be precise and definite early on because you may be wrong 2 years later, and also you need to be able to follow the student where they're going. I need to wrap this up. The other thing I wanted to mention quickly is that the recent studies have indicated that, contrary to what we had thought 10 to 15 years ago, the frontal lobes of the brain continue to expand and develop longer than we had thought. We thought that it stopped during adolescence, but it looks as if it goes up to at least ages 19 or 20. So that people's reasoning and cognitive abilities, and also their abilities not to handle just cognitive information, but their ability to make judgments, to tolerate ambiguity, to tolerate all the exigencies of life, their ability to do this increases even after they've started in the college year. So, I won't say, I was going to mention something about the SSRIs, but the reason for some of the large prescription of these medications is that when they were brought onto the market, just a little more maybe than 10 years ago now, they provided really our first very safe antidepressants. So there has been a big change in the prescription of antidepressants. When I first was working, we used something called tricyclic antidepressants, which had very dangerous side effects and could be lethal in overdosage. So it made a big difference once the SSRIs came on the market because we had a much safer antidepressant. So I do think that resulted in more people being willing to try to medicate people with depression, I think with excellent results. So why the increase in the prescribing of these licit drugs? One is, the first important thing to say as we look at the figures is that these drugs have been enormously helpful to people. They have really been a major breakthrough, and many people are getting treated for depression successfully who would not have been treated before. The second thing, though, to say is that SSRIs are not just useful in depression. They've been found to be useful with anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and bulimia, and mood regulation in some character disorders. So I think that with the wide range of the indications for these medications, when someone who is not very knowledgeable about adolescence, or a general physician who is not used to the psychiatric dimensions, when they see a troubled young person, feel that this is a catch-all that they can just use that will cover whatever it is that's going on without making a more precise diagnosis ahead of time, without watching the person carefully, and without having in mind what symptoms they're targeting. So I think that many people are treating what is adolescent dysphoria, often under pressure of the student or their families, with these medications because it is so difficult to diagnose at this time, and because the SSRIs have a wide range of usefulness. But as a result, we have many people on SSRIs that we really don't know whether it is helpful to them or not. And one of the big areas of research that is being certainly emphasized in the child and adolescent literature is that we do not know what these medications do in a developing brain, and that is really a research area that has largely not been addressed at this time, and that is an area waiting for us to have some neuroscience breakthroughs. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to deal with the shooting end of the drug war, both at home and abroad. And I'm going to start with the global picture and bring it down to the local level in about 12 minutes. So fasten your seatbelts. But the big picture, I want to explain why the drug war has failed and why I think it will never succeed. There are three problems we need to look at if our current drug strategy is to succeed at the global level. Three factors that we don't take very seriously in this country, certainly not in the U.S. Congress. And one of these three things has to be solved if our current strategy is to succeed. The first problem is extreme poverty, particularly in developing countries, in zones where a lot of these illicit crops are cultivated. Both the UN and the World Bank estimate that there are 1.2 billion people in the world who live on less than $1 a day. In a country like Colombia, 2/3 of the population lives below the poverty line, which is $2 a day. In Afghanistan, it's not uncommon to see farmers who live on $2 a month. We're talking about people living in extreme poverty who don't have much left to lose and are willing to take whatever risks are necessary to survive. The second factor, in addition to extreme poverty, is undiminished demand, the fact that we don't have sufficient treatment on request in this country. And I won't get into the details of this, but this is one area where I'm opposed to coerced treatment, simply because we don't have enough treatment slots for people who actually want treatment. And the third factor is the artificial escalation of the value of these basically worthless weeds and flowers. Put another way, the alchemists back in the Middle Ages, right, they tried for centuries to find a formula to turn lead into gold, and they never did succeed until our drug warriors got into the act. We have policies that quite literally turn weeds into their equivalent weight in solid gold. Both marijuana and gold are right now about $370 an ounce. Right, that's some pretty powerful alchemy. We've turned literally weed into gold. And for things like cocaine and heroin, they're worth many times their equivalent weight in solid gold. And so when you put these four things next to each other, extreme poverty, high demand, and these extreme profits, you've got a perfect storm that's almost impossible to stop. Another problem is that our legislators, though perhaps well-intentioned, when they see these kinds of behaviors, their natural instinct is to make you stop. This is illegal. You're growing an illegal crop, you're trafficking illegal drugs, you're putting illegal substances into your body, and their natural instinct is to escalate law enforcement. That's how you get people to stop breaking laws. Well, the problem when you do that in the face of a prohibition economy is that it almost always tends to backfire. One of the reasons is that the drug economy is one that tends to evolve under Darwinian principles, right? Selection of the fittest. When we escalate law enforcement, the people that we tend to catch tend to be the people who are dumb enough to get caught, right? No offense if anyone's ever been busted for anything, but the slang on the street is that the dealer who uses loses. You get careless, you get sloppy, you get apprehended. The people we tend to miss when we escalate law enforcement tend to be the people who are the most efficient, the most adaptable, the most innovative. We force them to stay one step ahead of the law. And so for decades now, we've had this unintentional policy, and I think the drug war is governed by the law of unintended consequences. We've had a policy of artificial selection. We've been selectively breeding super traffickers, if you will. We cannot hope to win a war on drugs when our policies see to it that only the most efficient operations survive. And not only do they survive, but they're richly rewarded because we've done two things to help them. Number one, we've taken out the competition for them. We've picked off the inefficient little fish. And number two, we've tried to constrict the supply while the demand remains high and constant, thereby driving up prices and profits and luring more people into this economy. And I'll give you another example of how this tends to backfire. People say, well, maybe don't go after little fish, go after the big fish. Well, you remember the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel, the two dreaded gigantic cocaine cartels. Well, the United States government helped the Colombian government break up those cartels more than a decade ago, and it was a valiant struggle. A lot of people lost their lives doing it. And you think, well, that should have done the trick, right? I mean, these were the monopolies, the two giant cartels. We destroyed them. But more drugs than ever are coming out of Colombia. So what happened? Well, the U.S. government likes to talk about democratizing things. We're going to democratize Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. I would argue that the only thing we've effectively democratized in Latin America through military force is the drug economy itself. Right? We took out the two big monopolies, and we opened up that space to literally hundreds of smaller operations, many of them family-run, vertically integrated, each with their own smuggling routes, their own list of officials they bribe. We can't even count the number of operations, anywhere between 1 and 600 I've seen estimates of. We can't even count them, much less try to infiltrate and stop them anymore. So we have democratized this economy. And so this is the problem. If you go after the little fish, you end up breeding super traffickers. If you go after the big fish, you end up democratizing the economy. And that's because neither approach really looks at why people are engaged in the drug economy to begin with, which has a lot more to do with profits, incredible profits of prohibition, as well as poverty. Another problem is that we've applied a war paradigm to this problem. And I worked for many years as a military and diplomatic historian, and one of the things I learned is that wars are about applying brute force to extract a political concession, a capitulation from a rational state actor. Well, we've been applying this paradigm against essentially plants, crops, right? The coca seed doesn't sit in the ground and think to itself, well, should I stay dormant for 6 more months? Will I fetch a better price at market then? What's the latest threat coming from the U.S. Congress? Am I going to get fumigated by one of these spray planes? Plants are not rational actors. They don't obey the laws of Congress. They obey the laws of nature and the laws of the market. But the problem is, because our policies of prohibition give these relatively worthless weeds so much value that millions of individuals around the world have attached themselves to this economy. And they do so because they think they'll get away with it, and by and large they do. And so when we talk about all of these individual actors around the world, whether it's the campesino in southern Colombia, or the lawyer in Midtown Manhattan snorting cocaine, or the kid in the high school bathroom dealing marijuana, or the guy in a street corner selling crack, you will never, ever get an organized capitulation, a coherent surrender from all of these individual actors. And so for decades, we've been waging a war against an enemy that is quite literally incapable of surrendering. All right, that's problem number one. But it isn't just a figurative quagmire. In Colombia, for instance, this has led us into, I think, a military quagmire, one that in many ways resembles the quagmire in Vietnam. We really have no exit strategy for Colombia. We don't have a logical stopping point. At what point do we declare success and go home? Is it when we wiped out 20% of the coca crop, 50%, 100%? Is the war finally over when U.S. citizens stop using drugs altogether? Or are we there to fight the guerrillas? Are we there to push them south of the equator or degrade their military capability, as was our objective in Kosovo? Is there an enemy capital to capture? Is there a flag to take down? No one's willing to say at what point we declare victory and go home. And so, to bring it home, you can apply a lot of these paradigms to the local drug markets as well. And before I worked on the issue of Colombia for the past couple of years, I worked at the domestic level in our inner cities, looking at particularly the most poverty-stricken communities. And I would come across addicts who were so drugged out, I mean, they couldn't stand up, they couldn't tell you what day of the week it was or who the president was, although that's a debatable issue, I suppose, these days. But my point is, these are people for whom tomorrow is not going to be a better day. They're products of failed educational systems, literally crumbling schools. I mean, I have not seen devastation as I've seen in East Baltimore. It's really quite incredible. And so for these people, there's a strong tendency there to self-medicate, to try to blot out the pain of their existence. I don't think it's a coincidence that malt liquor does well in communities where heroin does well. Apparently, Gray Davis and I are both getting recalled in 3 minutes. But these are people for whom their best days are behind them, and I find it very difficult to argue with them. And our response to them as a society has been to say, no, you need to be sober and have no job and no hope and no future and no opportunity. And that's not a good substitute for a social policy. And so until we deal with those problems, we're always going to scapegoat this issue. There's a wonderful quote by Craig Reinerman, a sociologist from UC Santa Cruz. And he says, drugs are richly functional scapegoats. They provide elites with fig leaves to place over the unsightly social ills over which they preside. And they provide the public with a restricted aperture of attribution, in which only the lone deviant or the chemical boogeyman come into view. And the cornucopia of complex problems are out of the picture. And for me, we can apply, our response has been to hire more police, more prosecutors, more prisons to deal with this problem, which is about as effective as digging more graves to solve the international AIDS crisis. It really doesn't solve anything. Just to give you, just to illustrate that and make it a little more concrete, in the year 2000, the Justice Policy Institute put out a remarkable report. The U.S. reached, in the year 2000, the 2 million prisoner mark. 2 million people behind bars. At that time, there were about 8 million prisoners in the entire world. Right? So with 1/22 of the world's population, the United States had 1/4 of the planet's prisoners. We operate the largest penal system. And of those 2 million people behind bars, I think it's 2.2 now, but if you look at that number, about 1/4 of them were there for non-violent drug offenses. Almost 500,000 people. That's more people behind bars than the entire European Union incarcerates for all offenses combined, including rape, murder, assault, and drugs. And they have about 90 million more people than we do. So either Americans are 7.5 times more evil than people in the European Union, or there's something seriously screwed up with our criminal justice system. So I'll leave it there and on that note. Thank you.
Thank you. I think only Norman could figure out how these very disparate and wonderful presentations were linked, but he certainly would have been delighted to see the next generation of drug policy activists like Sanho following in his tradition, and he would have welcomed the exploration of student problems and anxiety-reducing licit drugs on campuses. He always had a special concern about alcohol and other drugs that were prevalent on campuses too, and the concerns that they had. And I know that he would be excited by the dazzling breakthroughs on the understanding of addiction and brain function that Dr. Leshner talked about. But he would certainly continue to extol the need for solid psychotherapy as a crucial adjunct to the new chemistry. So this has been a really diverse and wonderfully engaging panel. Let's take some time for questions. There are microphones apparently on either side. And upstairs for whoever is up there that I can't possibly see because of the lights. Yes.
Hi.
Can you introduce your name and place?
My name is Ali, and I'm a sophomore here at the college. I'm from Pakistan. My question is to everybody today. My country was assisted the U.S. during the Cold War in the 80s, and there was a lot of drug trafficking going on between Pakistan and Afghanistan at that time. Because the U.S. needed the Afghans' help and the Pakistanis' help, the U.S. turned a blind eye to this massive sort of surfacing of the heroin market in particular. What do you think can be done or should be done to bring this issue to the attention of the bigger fish in the political scene, to not just restrict it to the public health policy arena, but to take it to the big world policymakers?
Andy, you want to try that one?
Well, I think a little bit Sanho's presentation helped answer your question. I think there's widespread agreement by thoughtful and well-meaning people that this is the most complex issue facing humankind in many ways. And the strategies that we've used historically have failed miserably. And that I, for one, agree that the policies aren't working. But what you haven't heard, and what I don't have an answer to either, is what, in fact, would be policies that would be effective when, in fact, we're facing a massive public health problem, and what kind of strategies could we employ that actually are going to work and could be put into play. I don't think it's the case that the world political scene doesn't understand that drugs are a problem and that they have different forms of that problem in different cultures. I think the problem is that we have not been willing to apply the same intelligence to developing complex strategies that are as complex as the problem itself.
Sandro, do you want to add to that?
There are those that want to apply a genetically engineered fungus to wipe out the poppy crops in Afghanistan. And there are others who want to bomb the storehouses of the opium and other things. And I would caution against that. It may sound counterintuitive, but there are an amazing number of addicts in surrounding countries that got addicted to very pure heroin. And the way they got addicted was through smoking, which you can do with very pure heroin. In the streets of Peshawar, you can get beg for 30 cents a day and support a pure heroin habit. And if we do succeed in cutting down the supply of opium and heroin in Afghanistan, the dealers are going to start cutting the product. And when you start cutting it to a certain point, you can no longer smoke it. And the only the way to get that same efficiency in delivery is to start injecting. And I don't have to tell you that there aren't a whole lot of clean needles in the area. So I would really caution and warn again about the law of unintended consequences.
Which is all the more to the question, which is how, trying to get this to the attention of the political leaders who could make a difference. Let's take a question over
Steve
here.
Helfer, law school staff. My question is to Dr. Sashner.
Leshner.
Excuse me?
Leshner.
Leshner, excuse me. There's been some research at Rockefeller University which seems to indicate that fatty food can be addictive. Also, there's been research that the internet can be addictive, and we all know about gambling addictions. My question to you is there any substance or behavior which is not addictive?
I don't know the answer to that question. If you had asked me 5 years ago whether there was a common essence to addiction, I would have answered either I don't know or I doubt it. However, what we have learned in the last 5 years is that, in fact, the same brain mechanisms that are involved in cocaine or heroin addiction are also involved in compulsive gambling, are also involved in compulsive overeating. I don't mean having a big dinner. I mean pathological overeating. And so I think we're just at a very early stage of coming to understand what those mechanisms are, and as we understand those mechanisms, we'll get a better sense of what in fact is addicting. Having said that, I think that what's important about addiction from a public health point of view is that addiction is compulsive, often uncontrollable, and the case we're talking about, drug craving, seeking, and use in the face of negative consequences. That's not always the case with things that appear to be, so-called addicting activities or addicting substances. So I don't have an answer to that.
Did you have a question back there? I can barely see through the light.
Yeah, Michael Otto from the medical school. Question for Dr. Leshner. First of all, great PowerPoint. But as part of the presentation, you talked about the importance of science penetrating into clinical care. And I'm curious about the same sort of process of, especially from the view of the directorship of NIDA, is science penetrating into policy? And as director, did you have an opportunity of getting the good science of NIDA into policymakers at all?
Sometimes. It's a very individual case, and there are policymakers who are interested in the science, and others who, make it up in the shower. So it's a very individual case. I like to believe, perhaps deceiving myself, that more and more the nation at large is understanding addiction to be a health issue, as well as being a social issue and all those other aspects that it has. But then I have to say, in the last few years, we've not seen a whole lot of policy progress along that line.
Yes.
Yes, I'm Rick Doblin, and I got my PhD from the Kennedy School 2 years ago. And my question is for Dr. Leshner.
Hi, Rick.
Hi. I was glad to see your last image of Albert Einstein because he was strongly against prohibition. My concern is about the misuse of science in the service of the drug war. We've just had an example where a paper published in Science that claimed that MDMA hurt dopamine and a single night's use could cause Parkinson's disease was retracted, and a lot of criticism from Nature has come. The journal Nature actually accused you of pandering to the Bush administration's jihad against recreational drug use.
Of all people, I'm the likely person to do that. You're right.
Well, they based that on your hyperbolic statements in the press release accompanying the original paper. The main educational tool that you created at NIDA about the plain brain after ecstasy in your anti-ecstasy campaign was based on data that's now discredited. Larger studies have not shown that. NIDA disavows it. The Peter Jennings is doing a special on ecstasy. They asked NIDA for that image. NIDA says they don't even have it, can't find it. My question is, the laws were based upon misleading and inaccurate science, in part. You testified before Congress and gave the impression that cerebral blood flow was affected by MDMA.
Can you ask
when
your
it's
question,
not.
please? Sorry.
Do you think that we can accommodate a nuanced drug policy that acknowledges beneficial uses of these drugs, particularly the therapeutic use of MDMA? And do you think the laws should be reevaluated now that the science is being reevaluated?
I think that science changes over time. We learn things over time. I'm not going to get into a big argument about the harangue. I'll skip that part. But the truth is that we do understand greater and greater nuances over time. There's a very large body of literature independent of the studies you're referring to that supports that ecstasy is not a benign substance, so let's not take that one up yet again. But the truth is that we have to have policies that A, evolve, and B, use science to decide what will have a beneficial and a non-beneficial. There's an awful lot of assertion that many substances have beneficial effects, when in fact, not only have they not been subjected to scientific tests, but in my experience, no proposals have been submitted to do those tests as well. So I stand by the position that says, let the science drive the policy, and if you don't have the science, try to go get the science when it's appropriate and when it's defensible.
Okay.
That's my position.
Let's take one over here, and then I'm going to use the chair's prerogative and ask a question.
Alan Leshner, if I may direct this to you, and I hate to keep on doing that, but this is an appraisal of U.S. drug policy, and you're the one who's talking about blending the criminal and the therapeutic aspects of this. You've gone through these displays about some of the impacts of drug abuse, but we know quite concretely the impacts of alcohol abuse in this society. 100,000 people dead every year. We manage that through public health systems without criminalizing the distribution system and without criminalizing alcoholics. Why is that system not directly applicable to drug abuse?
First of all, I would argue...
Substance abuse.
Yeah, I got it. First of all, I would argue we have not done a very good job of managing the alcohol problem in this country, when in fact we continue to have alcohol as one of the largest killers of people in this country. Secondly, it's a very different phenomenon, as we learned during Prohibition, to take something away that's always been there, as opposed to provide something in effect. One of the lessons of Prohibition was that, in fact, although it was accompanied by terrible social problems, it did, in fact, reduce use tremendously, so that the act of making it available does affect the use rates. I, for one, when I talk about blending criminal justice and health approaches, I'm talking about dealing with people who are incarcerated. I'm not talking about whether or not you should be put in jail for using drugs. I'm talking about people who are committing crimes, who happen to be addicted, who are going to be incarcerated. And what I want is that everyone who has committed a crime, who is addicted, is offered treatment. If I had my way, would be provided treatment. And I think that that's the kind of blending of criminal justice and health approach that we've got to see. It is stupid, frankly, to just arrest people who are addicted and not provide treatment, because I promise you they'll be back. That's what the blending is, for me, of criminal justice and health approaches.
I'd like to pick up on the issue of alcohol and ask Dr. Siggins if she'd be willing to talk a little bit about what your sense of the alcohol issue on college campuses is.
That's a very complicated issue. There's been a lot of publicity recently about increasing alcohol use on campuses, and there is a study organized, I guess it's from the University of Michigan, in Michigan, that's been collecting the statistics on college alcohol use since about the 1940s, 1950s. And pretty much they show that with some variation, it's roughly stayed around the same over the years. The issue that people are wondering about now is whether it's not so much the incidence of use, but the binge drinking situation that's increasing. And that is always a worry, the amount of alcohol drunk in a very short period of time, and particularly if it's in students who've not particularly been used to drinking, can be lethal, and it is something that is a worry on every campus. And that certainly is present. Again, it does seem to have increased, but we were not asking the questions about binge drinking before. I'm not quite sure when we started asking more about it, but I think certainly within the last 10 years, but not before that. So I think it's rather hard to compare the instances and to know exactly how much it has increased. On college campuses, the worry is really in people's judgment, and particularly, let me say something else. The students who use alcohol heavily, the research shows that the vast majority of them have begun drinking in high school, and when they look at alcohol education in high school, they find out that the vast majority of those that drink in high school have in fact started these days in middle school. So in order to address the issue, it's not just something that college campuses can address, and it's not as if just through education you can address these issues. Some of the drinking patterns really go back a long way, and that it has a great deal to do with attitudes, families, probably family cohesion patterns that go back to middle school at least. And the other thing about alcohol intake is that many of the other things on campuses that concern us are often associated with alcohol use. Sexual assault, very, very high percentage of sexual assault, either of the two people involved has been drinking. Suicide, alcohol use, other drug use is a very high risk factor in suicide on campus. So it's a very important issue, and one that worries everybody, and it's really a matter also of judgment for students. Frequently their judgment is distorted in terms of both how much they've been drinking and the consequences and for them afterwards.
Thank you. We're running out of time. What I'd like to do is just take these three questions, and then maybe our panelists can combine the answers. So you had a question. They have to be short questions. That's the other part of the deal. You had a question?
Yes. So Mr. Tree, please. Well, during the last 15 years, my name is Roberto Talleria, from Bolivia. The U.S. has been providing technical assistance and logistical assistance in order to overcome the problem of illicit drug production. Basically, the idea was to replace illicit crops by licit crops. In this direction, many farmers have perceived that the alternative options were not feasible. To a certain extent, the reason was that U.S. and the European Union subsidies and domestic support, both contained in the Amber Box, damper international prices, making unfeasible any switch or any shift from illicit crop to licit crops. I would like to know what is your opinion regarding to what should be the next step for the U.S. external policy, taking into account that past plans have failed.
Okay, thank you. Quick question, yes.
Yeah, this is also for Mr. Tree. My name is Bo Kilmer, and I'm a PhD student here at the Kennedy School. It's a question about your stance on coerced treatment. Are you arguing that we should not utilize coerced treatment with addicts in the criminal justice system until we have enough beds for addicts outside of the criminal justice system? And if this is so, why do you think this is good public policy?
Okay. Final question.
Del Lamagna, the Progressive Government Project. I'm particularly interested in policy. Mr. Tree, you seem to be saying that if we could take one of those causes, let's say the high cost of the product and eliminate that through a policy being decriminalize it, get the price down. That'll solve, to me, it doesn't solve the drug problem. What Dr. Leshner is suggesting, the way we solve the drug problem is treatment, forced treatment, even that works. So as a policy, what are you recommending to our next government?
Okay. Sanho, you start, and then I'll let the other panelists comment, and then we'll close.
Okay, very briefly, on the question of alternative development, I think it's been a terrible disaster. I think it's making the problem worse in many ways, not only in Bolivia, but particularly in Colombia, in the area of Putumayo, where I do focus a lot. These are very remote areas that are underdeveloped. There's no infrastructure to speak of. And instead of these campesinos growing coca and growing poppy, we are literally forcing them, almost at gunpoint, to basically grow hundreds of kilos of so-called legal crops, fruits and vegetables, to transport on vehicles they don't have, over roads that literally don't exist, to sell in markets both domestic and export they don't have access to. And even if they did, to compete against an international global economy, agribusiness imports, very often subsidized by our tax dollars, against which they don't stand a chance. And it hasn't been working. And in the midst of a 4-decade-old civil war in Colombia, we are alienating the very people, the very campesinos, the peasant farmers, who we need to win over. And we're pushing them away from the state and into the arms of our declared enemies, the guerrillas, the paramilitaries, the narco-traffickers. So it's been a terrible disaster in that respect. On the coerced treatment question, I think it's insane that we don't have universal treatment on request. Congress authorized it in 1988. They just never got around to appropriating the money for it. And so I think it makes no sense to literally turn away people who are begging to get treatment. And instead, getting people who are caught by the police, sentenced by a judge in a drug court to get treatment whether they need it or not. I don't believe that all use is abuse. I don't believe all abuse is addiction. And I think we need to treat those things differently. And I think we need to stop wasting very valuable treatment slots on people who very often don't need it. On the question of what would I tell the next administration, I think prohibition has not worked. It cannot work. I think we've been sold a myth about prohibition. And the myth is that prohibition doesn't mean you control drugs. It means you give up the right to control drugs. We choose not to regulate. And I think we need to find a way to bring these substances, and perhaps keep some of them illegal, but there are others we need to bring under the domain of the law so we have some control, because the people who control this economy are by definition criminals and very often organized crime. And their interests are very different from the interests of legitimate drug manufacturers or people who are actually concerned about purity and safety and those kinds of things. So I think, it's a conscious decision we've made not to regulate these things.
Thank you. Comments from either of you?
Well, I would just like to second the point about treatment on demand. We have to begin with a policy that says that anybody who needs treatment ought to have access to it. In a modern democracy, it's ridiculous that we have some estimate of 800,000 to 1 million heroin addicts, and we have 200,000 publicly funded treatment slots. That's just absurd. So that's where I would start. I would say, just to try to answer your policy statement, there's an old, I think it's Thai Chinese in origin saying that says, never underestimate the value of square one. And if I had my way, the next administration would in fact try to begin conceptualizing a drug policy not from this bimodal supply-demand model that we've had forever, and try to start all over again with a fresh approach. I don't have an answer of how to do that. I'm a public health guy. I see everything from a public health filter. But I can't imagine that if you put together people to start again in a policy, we couldn't come up with something that's better than what we've been doing for the last 100 years.
And I can't think of any place better to start doing that than the Kennedy School. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the people at the Kennedy School and the medical school who helped put this panel together. And I particularly want to thank Dorothy for her support of this continuing effort to keep Norman's memory alive and to bring together a lively group of people for important discussions. And I look forward to seeing all of you at the Red Sox-Cubs World Series. Thank you.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, this is no.
Yeah.
Where are you? It's up here.